The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings and welcome to today's webinar, Empowering Parent Leaders Through Dialogue, a model for parent advocacy and education. Thank you for joining us in this final webinar that the Funders Group has organized for 2019. My name is Iris Alent, a consultant for the Funders Group, and I will be the moderator for today. Before we begin, I would like to note that everyone will be in listen-only mode during the presentation portion of today, and we do strongly encourage discussion throughout today's webinar. There is a questions box where you can enter any questions you have throughout the session. And then in the second half of our webinar, when we transition to the Q&A, you can raise your hand, which is a small little hand icon next to your name, and you will be unmuted to share your question. If you have any technical issues, you can also message those in the questions box. Finally, I would like to note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to everybody who registered. And at the end, you will be invited to respond to a brief survey about today's discussions. Next slide, please. This webinar is 1 hour in length, with the first portion dedicated to hearing about Kindred's model and approach, as well as the parent facilitator experience. And then in the second half of our webinar, we'll have a discussion with our speakers and open the floor for discussion to those on the call and address some of the questions that are coming in through the questions box. Next slide. Today's webinar was organized by the Funders Group on Parent Organizing, Family Engagement, and Leadership Development. The Funders Group is a collaborative network of foundation professionals from about 20 different grant-making organizations across the country and is focused on elevating the voice, leadership, and expertise of parent leaders in communities of color and low-income communities. We chose to focus on today's topic because this model and approach is both innovative and has produced great insights into parent leadership and how parents can affect change in their local communities through dialogues on race and equity. We are also excited to hear the parent perspective and how this experience can be applied to other parent organizing and leadership work. And as a Funders Collaborative, we are also interested to learn more about how a funder has effectively partnered to support this work and share those learnings with our network. Next slide, please. I am deeply honored to introduce our incredible speakers for today. We are joined by Laura Wilson Phelan, the Executive Director and founder of Kindred. For over 20 years, Laura has led social change efforts at grassroots and management levels across the nonprofit and government sectors. She's currently an elected representative to the DC State Board of Education and formerly held senior leadership roles at the Flamboyant Foundation, Teach for America, and Teach for All. We're also joined today by Mike Dixon, a parent organizer and facilitator at Kindred. Mike started as a participant in Kindred and then became a dialogue facilitator at his child's school. Impressed with the process and vision of Kindred, he now organizes parents and facilitates across multiple schools in DC. And last but not least, we are also joined today by Ira Hillman. Ira leads a portfolio at the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, a family foundation that seeks to define, elevate, and activate human connection as essential to human thriving. A key focus of Ira's portfolio is supporting parents in establishing emotional connection with their children from the earliest days of life to create the foundation for empathy, helping behaviors, and healthy interpersonal engagement. And another area of interest is leveraging the shared experience of parenting to build relationships among families across lines of difference. Next slide. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Laura and Mike from Kindred to share with us this approach to parent leadership. Laura?
Terrific. Well, I'm so excited to be on this call today, and thank you all in advance for your time and interest in learning more about Kindred. Really excited to share our innovative way of approaching family organizing and what we're learning today. Next slide, please. So Kindred is a network of diverse parents committed to advancing equitable opportunities for all children. And we do use the term parent to encompass all caregivers. So you'll hear me use that term throughout this presentation with the consciousness that it's designed to be an inclusive term that means something really specific, but we are using it to encompass all caretakers in a child's home environment. Next slide, please. Our vision, if you can picture this for a moment, is a society where every individual thrives by collaborating for the well-being of others. And if you could just take a minute to imagine a school where you walk in and all the adults in that building care for one another's children as if they were their own children. And I don't know how many of you on the call today are parents yourselves, but the amount of love and tenderness and care about the child's future that you give to your own child. Imagine if that was collectively shared by all of the adults in the school building. And it was shared through a lens of understanding the role that racism has played in our country and dividing and creating structures and oppressive environments where that has not been the case. Imagine the kinds of things that could open up for children and for families. And that's what you have in terms of Kindred's vision. A society where everybody thrives and that we're collaborating for the well-being of others. And we realized this by starting in elementary schools and building trusting relationships among parents and among staff, and ultimately between parents and staff of diverse backgrounds, and then catalyzing them to work together with school leadership and system leaders to drive equity in their schools and communities. So that's a really important phrase. We are not an agitative organization. There may be a point in time where agitation is necessary, as is part of organizing often. But for now, we've found that we're able to make tremendous progress together by actually reducing the friction between system and school leaders and families, and paving a clear pathway forward so that all of those folks can work together on the same page to ensure that life outcomes for children are improving across the board without regard to race and socioeconomic class. So I'm happy to share a little bit with you about how we are doing that. Next slide, please. So we work at all three levels. I'm going to explain what this slide is about a little bit. So you'll see some white letters on the page, and you'll see some blue letters on the page. So we work at both an individual school level and across the whole system to try to drive this change in this vision that I've just shared with you. And this theory about working across all three levels comes from research in social science that identifies that when you can work across personal, social, and structural levels in a personal capacity, helping to create the ability and the desire for these changes, you are about 4 times as likely to achieve outcomes than you are if you were just to work within one of these circles. So we're trying to create ecosystem enablers that reinforce all of the personal and structural change that is happening. And so I've listed in here some of the questions that we are asking at an individual level to give you a sense of what we actually mean by this. So at a personal level, you'll see in the white, do parents feel welcome? Are the set of things we're asking them to do or the experience they're having in a school going to make them feel ashamed or welcome? And then at a system level, how is the system and the individuals that are running systems expressing their belief about parents of different backgrounds? Same thing at the social level, a set of questions about what are the unspoken but understood norms around how parent behavior is operating in that school environment and the assumptions around it. And then across the structural level, what are the policies, practices, and environmental influences with regard to how people and where people live and work, and decisions are made that enable or don't create enabling environments for this vision to become a reality. So I'm going to take you through each of these in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Our theory of change, when it's taken all together, has 3 components. We start with school-based proof points, and that's really, really important because we believe that, and we have found that we are doing something unique and that is not being done in other spaces. Therefore, we have to prove that it works first on an individual school basis before it can scale to a systemic level. And then secondly, part of that proof is research and evaluating what is actually happening and why it is happening so that can scale and so that school systems can actually take this on and adopt it as a best practice for their work. And then ultimately creating the enabling ecosystem that will continue to perpetuate this set of changes in the school environment. And that includes very explicitly engaging parents as co-designers of educational experiences for their children, believing that families, especially those who have been most oppressed and marginalized by our society, have the answers that will point us to how to reach equity. But we need to create the approach, the feeling, the environment, the social context, the expectations where those ideas can come to the surface and be heard, and where various people play roles relevant to their particular authority structure, time, capacity, and skill set that can advance those ideas. And ultimately, we're seeking a change that will be measurable in terms of what we're calling collective well-being. And we're defining that as children and families thriving without difference by economic situation, racial or ethnic identity, ability, or any other distinct designation. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. To make sure that I have driven this point clear, we are at this point a direct services organization working within DC schools, specifically in elementary schools. That includes early childhood for DC, which, as many of you likely know, is universal for pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. And we have found that the majority of our families do actually fall into the early childhood bucket, which we welcome because it gives us many years to work with them and to realize this change. So I'll spend the next several minutes talking about our school-based approach. Next slide, please. We partner with schools for 3 years at a minimum. Our desire is to leave within 3 years, having created the structures and the systems that will allow that to take effect. And so I'm going to go back, if you remember that slide with the 3 circles. We start at the personal level, shifting personal beliefs and actions through small group dialogue. So you see a little picture there of 2 groups of people who are parents. They're designed to represent parents in an elementary school from a mix of racial and economic backgrounds. They come together for 10 weeks. They discuss a series of things associated with a curriculum that we have developed in small groups that are professionally facilitated by 2 Kindred staff members of different racial identities. In those groups, they talk about their own identity, their experiences with education and those of their parents, their hopes and fears for their children. They talk explicitly about systemic, interpersonal, and internalized racism and how that manifests in a school community and how it's demonstrated through data. And then at the end, they take an action together that they determine based on a root cause analysis of what the root causes of inequity are in their school community. And we culminate the groups with them taking those actions together. And that's really important to cement the mindset shift that's begun to take place into an actual set of actions that now parents are practicing together across lines of difference. Next slide, please. In year 2, we grow and norm this anti-racism movement that we've begun to create. Parents actually run the next set of groups. So you can see 4 new groups created there. And we train and support those parents as our primary intervention in that school in the 2nd year. And it's very, very involved. Those 8 parents are the parents we've identified who will be the likely vanguards of change in their school, and that they will be promoting it both through their work in facilitating dialogue and growing this movement, but also socializing the kinds of ideas that are being talked about. And I can share with you, if you're interested, during the Q&A, all the ways that we work on socializing these kinds of new behaviors and norms and ideas associated with explicitly talking about racism, explicitly centering the ideas from families who have been furthest from opportunity and the ways that parents in the school operate. And what we begin to see is that this is starting to create a tipping point. And most of the social science associated with creating tipping points indicate that when you can reach 20% of a population, that is sufficient. So what we're trying to do is obviously we can't work with every single parent in the school community, and that would be cost prohibitive. So what we're trying to do is work with, frankly, as few as we need to create a tipping point within the school community. Next slide, please. So in year 3, what we do is essentially help all of these actions and parents who have now had this really deep and transformative experience to come together in an organization that usually is called some form of an equity committee, to keep these actions going and to think structurally about how they can help the school to shift in a more permanent way toward introducing practices and policies that are more equity driven. So here's a list of a few things in terms of examples of what parents and schools have done so far. They've created inclusive back to school nights, a parent buddy system, WhatsApp group just for Spanish speaking families. They've supported one another with transportation to school, accompaniment to mental health appointments, and many, many, many more things. There are over 30, probably 50 at this point, different actions that parents are driving in their school communities that are getting at the root causes of how our very well-intentioned, oftentimes, policies are actually manifested in the school setting in an inequitable way. Next slide, please. At the same time, structurally, we know that it's not enough just to work with the families on showing up in spaces differently and building collaborative partnerships and relationships with one another and increasing their racial consciousness. We also need to work with school leadership in ensuring that there are pathways that are smooth and tension-free for parents to be providing input to those school leaders and ways that the school leader can operate in a more equity and racially conscious way. And so we spend part of every year in coaching relationships and in trust-based partnerships with school leaders. Next slide, please. And then ultimately, now we are in 13 schools across DC. We started 3 years ago in just one. This year, we'll touch over 1,000 parents with this model. And we know that it's really important for us to organize them across schools. So now we have this huge anti-racist, mixed race, mixed class coalition of families who are driving change in their own schools and are on fire about it. And you can imagine what that kind of coalition could do across a city when important resource decisions are being made associated with investments in schools and other areas too, like housing. And so our intention with this network that will be developed this year, and it will exist in an online digital platform, is for us to continue to engage these families after we leave a school community, keep them active, keep them sharing ideas with one another by providing them with channels to do exactly that, pushing out resources to help inform their practices, and finally, organizing them around ideas that they think are important and continuing to build the relationships that have fueled the growth and the energy that we've seen to date. Next slide, please. And so all together, I know this is a really busy slide, and when I am sharing this with others that I don't know, I always say I don't apologize for how complicated this is, because it is complicated work that we are doing. We are trying to address the root causes of institutionalized, interpersonal, and internalized racism as they manifest in our schools in order to drive equity. And thinking and believing deeply and seeing it manifest that parents are the ones that will drive the change together and in partnership with school staff and leadership. And so you'll see here how it all plays together. You start to see the personal shifts in beliefs, plus the growth that's socializing that set of mindsets, undergirded by structures that can support that change ongoing, and leadership that's open and eager to hear from families, and supported by a digital network that allows us to keep growing the space of families, leading to the changes that you see in the pink boxes on the right. And in each of those stages are the stages that we believe are required to start to see the change manifest in collective well-being, which would be, will measure and produce a composite indicator over the next 5 years about what that actually means. But for now, it's a combination of looking at academic outcomes, social emotional outcomes, climate, a sense of belonging in the school community. And we believe that those 3 steps that you see listed, so first creating a welcoming environment, increase positive self-identity and the parent's capacity to support their child, combined with relational trust across staff and between staff and families, leads to more aligned school home values, a nurturing school environment for all children, especially those facing adverse conditions, and increased support for students at home and school. And that those are the things that will drive these kinds of changes in ways that we haven't seen a system do very rapidly to date, right? Even our, I don't know how many of you saw the NAEP scores that came out today, but even in some of our quote unquote fastest improving school districts, we're seeing rates of 2 and 3% improvement per year, and still 50% gaps between white families and families of color in terms of just academic test scores, which we know is an imperfect and incomplete measure. We're trying to accelerate that pace of change by ensuring that families are able to drive that movement and really increasing the amount of capacity of the system to do this, because families are a part of this and feel ownership over the change. Next slide, please. And this model is not new necessarily. You may notice Cesar Chavez, gay rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and Obama, they all started with small house meetings and one-to-one personal persuasion conversations in order to catalyze their movements that manifested in a shift in social beliefs and ultimately led to significant, meaningful changes for the populations that have been most marginalized by our system. We're just building on the shoulders of giants and transferring this kind of model into our school system through parents. Next slide, please. This is my final slide. I know there's a lot of text on it, but we have, for the past 3 years, done rigorous evaluations of our program, even from our very first pilot program, knowing that what we're doing is unique and new, and we need to be able to measure it and show to people what is working and what is changing. So our first study was done by the Urban Institute. Last year's study was done by Community Science, and this year's study was done by an independent consultant. And every year, as we build on our model and test it, we're finding more and more evidence that our theory of change is proving to be true, and we're seeing tangible shifts in resources available to families and in the factors that we know influence outcomes for students. So 2 very quick examples of that. We have 4 third and fourth year partner schools. Our pilot school has stayed for a 4th year, and that's partly because they were a guinea pig for us and lots of stops and starts. And across 3 of them, we've seen principals choose to allocate resources out of very tight budgets to hire family liaison officers to carry forward this work. So that's one evidence piece of meaningful resource shifts, that the one new position they create is this position to carry forward this equity-driven work that brings families together with staff and school leadership to drive change. And the second is in one school, and this is Mike's school, who you'll hear from in a minute. A set of Black families who participated in dialogue group decided to work with school administration on increasing the number of Black staff who were part of the school community, and especially teachers. And through the work that they did together in sourcing candidates, making candidates feel welcome, ensuring that this is an environment where Black professionals could thrive, they increased the percentage of hires in the last year from 14 to 32% of staff. And in 1 year, that kind of change we are seeing happen across all of our schools in terms of meaningful shifts in ways that matter for educational outcomes for children. So let me stop there. If you turn to the next slide, please. I know we're going to spend some time hearing from a parent who has been through dialogue and then also is now a facilitator and has just recently joined Kindred's staff. So I'm pleased to introduce you to Mike Dixon. Mike, are you there?
I'm here. I was just basking in the glow of my beautiful young boys that are pictured on the slide here.
So, Mike, I'd love for you to share with the folks on the line about how you first got involved in Kindred and what it felt like. And keeping in mind, we don't have a ton of time, but what was that like for you?
Well, when actually, my wife is the person who volunteered me to join, if you will. She gave my information to a Kindred recruiter, and Kendria was her name. She reached out to me more times than I can recount here. It wasn't something I was necessarily interested in, but I felt like I just had to go because of all of the energy and effort she expended reaching out to me. And I went in to the first Kindred session, and I was a little bit shocked, to be honest, to have a diverse group of people and talk about things that aren't talked about across cultural lines was interesting for me. I found that to be interesting. I was a little hesitant, but after the first session, I was sold. I couldn't wait to the next session, and I got so excited about coming to the sessions. The first session, we just kind of talked about who we are. There's this thing we do called Identity Star, to talk about the different facets of our lives, and we just got to know each other. But after that first, maybe even the second session, I was showing up. The group was every other week. I was showing up on the in-between weeks because I was so excited. I would forget that it was, it's not this Wednesday. Okay, no problem. I guess I'll see them next week. So it has been, one of the most fulfilling things that I've done.
Thank you so much, Mike. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a facilitator.
Wow. So going through the process, you identify 2 parents that will facilitate the following year. And I was one of the parents that was identified as a potential candidate for that. And I was excited about the idea. So I jumped at it. And the process of facilitating was invigorating for me because there's some shifts that happened to me while I was going through the process, and I wanted to be a perpetuator of those shifts for other people. So I could see those shifts happening in the group I was facilitating at Yu Ying. And I was so excited about that I said, hey, if you're in another school and you need, people to facilitate, that's something I would be interested in. And, I remember you, Laura, saying, be careful what you ask for. So now here we are, and I'm on staff.
Yeah, yeah. What has the impact on you been from this Kindred experience collectively, both when you were in dialogue and even now as a facilitator?
Okay, I would say there's several things I could discuss, and we could probably spend, the whole afternoon in this question alone. But I'll be as, very brief, and I'll try and shape some context for you. As a African American male, I grew up in D.C. Going to school. It was homogenously Black in D.C. Our communities were Black, our schools were Black, and here's the thing about schools: we were understood. We were told as kids, don't question the school. The teacher's always right. The school was an authority figure in my life. And it seemed that my mom, who was active in the school, also saw the school as an authority figure. While they tried to make sure kids had things and had the best of things and were the brightest students, everybody saw the school as an authority figure. What happened for me in the process, going through the process, I learned that I don't have to view the school as an authority figure. And what's given to me is not what I have to accept. I can look at the school. I should be looking at the school as a service provider, and I should see myself as a collaborator with the school, co-designing how we, what's best for our children. And that was just a radical. I mean, that was really radical for me. That was a radical shift for me. As a matter of fact, when I first verbalized it, it was even radical for me to hear myself saying it. And going through that process and having that shift, as a facilitator, I'm seeing that same shift and other shifts happen in other people. And that's, gratifying is not a good enough word to explain how I feel about going through that shift and seeing that shift and what that means for my children and the people whom I'm able to facilitate, what that means for their children and what it means for our children collectively. I don't even have a word to define how I feel about that.
That's really powerful. Why, can you say a little bit more about why that matters, that you see? It might seem obvious, but I don't know if it's obvious. If you always think that schools are supposed to be the authority that's imbuing an education on our children, and that we do promote a narrative in this country where the schools are in charge of educating our children, and that, in some cases you just leave them at the door and you let us take care of it. So why does that matter that you're seeing them now as a service provider?
Well, even when I was a child, I was labeled talented and gifted. But that, as an adult, I see the different pathways that has led to generally, for those of us that were talented and gifted, and those of us that weren't. But my friends who weren't talented and gifted weren't less able. Maybe they just learned a little differently. And when we try to prescribe a box for this particular for education, we try to prescribe a set of rules that don't apply to everybody. What happens is, I don't want to get into the whole, I could get into the philosophy of this and what the numbers look like as far as results of kids that did certain things. But the reality, what I'm getting at is, all children are capable of learning, and as parents, the parents' voice has not been used to help co-design what this system looks like. And a lot of times I think of, like, let's say computers, for example, and I think of end users, and I think of, like, I don't want to get too caught up in this tangent, but I think of, like, when you used to have to use command line versus now being able to use graphic user interface. That system was designed with the end user in mind. I don't believe the school was designed with the end user in mind. And I believe that when parents' voices are elevated and parents feel their voices have value, then the system can be designed with the end user in mind. And that's so important to me because I have two children who are very different. One of my children has an IEP, and one of my children doesn't. It's important that they both get taught in the way that they receive information, that they're educated to be the best that they can be in their respective gifts and talents, as opposed to learning towards being put in a box and learning towards something that may not fit them. I don't know if that made sense. But yeah, okay,
that's
good.
great. So just really briefly, what impact have you seen of Kindred's work on your own kids' school?
Oh wow! So our school is, I guess it's in the fourth year now. It's
In our third year, yeah.
Okay, so I think I started in the first year. From the first year, well, even going back beyond that, I remember I was so excited just to get into the school. My kids would be able to learn Chinese, and it's such a marketable skill, right? So I was so excited to be able to just be a part of this community. But when I went to like the open house, I didn't feel like a part of the community. I felt like I was being interrogated, by people who felt like this was their home and they needed to know whether I qualified to even be in the space. So the first year of Kindred, brought some of us together to just kind of build relationships, and those relationships are standing the test of time, by the way. And then in the second year, facilitating, I invited some of the people I knew to come and join, and some other people were recruited. The movement started to branch out, and in that second year, we started an equity group, and that equity group was a place where we could kind of decompress some of these ideas and start figuring out what kind of work we could do to make the school a more equitable place, so that other parents who come to the school don't feel like they're being interrogated, and to see whether they qualify, right? So from the equity group, we started 3 working groups. We started cultural. I may not remember all the names of the groups, but I remember the functions. We started a cultural awareness and communications group, so that because our school is so diverse, and there's some things that just happen on the playground, and some things that happen in the listserv, and some things that happen in the PTO meetings that are communicated in such a way that it does more harm than it does good. So we started a community working group that would deal with those types of communications and cultural awareness. Also, our teachers, our Chinese teachers, don't get a real cultural awareness training as they come over. So we wanted to have an impact on that because most of them have never even seen Black people, for example. Then the group that I was so excited to lead was Laura spoke about it a little bit, was a staff diversity group, because all of our teachers outside of our Chinese teachers, whom we want, because we know we're in this community where kids will learn Chinese, so we want native Chinese speakers. But outside of that community, all of our teachers were young white women who were fantastic. We're not saying they were bad teachers, but none of them represent our student base. So our students don't come to school and say, maybe one day I'll be a teacher, because they don't look like, the teachers don't look like them. So we wanted to make sure that we were doing everything we could to be able to recruit people who would mirror the diversity that we have in our student body. And even in the first year, just through relationships, I think Laura said this number, we went from 14% to 32% new hires as far as our, for people of color, as far as our staff diversity efforts were measured. And we're really excited about that. And then there's a family engagement work group as well, just to make sure that, people who may be dealing with food insecurity, may be dealing with, the lack of resources, can't afford clothes, or whatever the challenges may be, that there's somebody that can, intervene in that space. So those 3 working groups came out of our second year, and we're in our 3rd year now. We're really excited about, what the future holds for us at UYing.
Awesome. Mike, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you in the final round. So turning it back to you all.
All right. Thank you, Laura and Mike, for sharing what a unique approach, but also how this experience of facilitating such deep parent dialogues has really impacted both your school community and your personal life. So I really appreciate that conversation. We do have Ira on the line, and I would also like to explore how Kindred has partnered so successfully with the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust. Ira, are you there?
I am.
Great. Well, thank you both for discussing candidly this relationship that's formed through this work. This first question is for Ira. Why was the trust interested in Kindred, and how did this relationship first come about?
Sure. So for those of you who maybe don't know as much about the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, you heard a little bit in the introduction. Our mission is helping people get along better. And this strategy has always been grounded in the idea that people at every stage of life need the relationships, experiences, and environments that help them build skills like trust, compassion, and kindness that are the building block for working together across difference. But we also know that behavior change is hard, and so we've always tried to look for critical inflection points in people's lives because we know that's a time when you can change behavior. And so for the work we do in early childhood or for adolescence or whatever, we have these inflection points of being born, starting school, starting college, or whatever the case may be. And we were leveraging existing systems. But in adulthood, where there wasn't sort of that system to leverage, we were instead thinking, what are other kinds of inflection points? And we thought the inflection point of parenthood is one that we already had a partnership with the National Parent Leadership Institute, and we knew from their work that the bonding nature of being a parent helped adults bridge differences across race, class, and culture. And so, Laura had been at Flamboyant. She and I had talked a couple times then, and when she said she was leaving to start Kindred, I said, hey, I want to know more about this, because we keep trying to find programs that are leveraging adults when they have that parent hat on as a way of bridging difference. And then as her idea really, the first year as the program really got off the ground, we saw that this was a real example of a program that was leveraging the shared identity of parents, of kids of a similar age, to build social capital across difference, all rooted in the ideas of human connection and common humanity, which ground our work of helping people get along better. And so at EFCT, we had a grant vehicle that we called Strategy R&D, which was a way of saying, there are parts of our strategy that are maybe a little more nascent that we want to explore. And rather than hiring somebody to go do a literature review or do some academic research, we felt that the best way to learn was to learn alongside people doing the work on the ground. And so we made an 18-month investment in Kindred to really help us better understand how you could bring adults together across difference using the parenting hat. And that's what happened, is we learned a lot from them.
Great, thank you. I'm curious to hear from you, Laura, what the relationship between Kindred and the Trust has been like, and how it's kind of morphed. And then Ira, also feel free to chime in as well.
It's been amazing for us. Embedded in the mission of Einhorn is relationships, and that relationships transform lives, and we should be striving to understand one another better, which, as I'm sure you heard, is the underlying operating principle of all of Kindred's work. And so it was a lovely alignment from the beginning. And what made me more excited about that is the intense interest in learning together that Ira just described. And we had outcomes we were striving for in the first 18 months of associated with the grant period, and yet there was always more interest in the learning associated with those outcomes. then trying to put us in a box to ensure that we had exactly 80 parents that we had gathered, or we had exactly this or that. It was more about, hey, we think our best guess is it's those 80 parents, but if we don't hit it, what we are really interested in is knowing why, rather than having you come back to us and say, like, you made a set of resource trade-off decisions that might not have been in the best interest of the program just to hit somewhat artificial number. And for us, that was really, really important. It's still really important because our organization continues to learn and adopt and adapt new practices as we grow and strive to influence the way that systems work with families. And so having us grounded in that learning, that's just created a lovely, lovely information flow back and forth, where I consider Ira and his team to be true partners in this work. There isn't this top-down fear of them taking our money away, or requiring a set of things that don't feel like they're helping us further our program. And it's just been such a blessing and gift. And in part and parcel to living out those core values, Ira's been extremely generous in introducing us with other folks that he thinks could potentially be aligned to the work that we're doing. That leads to more partnerships. So it's just been a wonderful manifestation of what partnership can look like.
And I'll just add that, it's in all the work any of us do, we always think about, what is the intent of what we do and what's the actual impact. And so hearing reflected back from a grantee that our intent of our grant making approach really embodying relationship-based philanthropy and a culture of learning and improvement is actually what we were able to deliver on in this partnership in particular. Really makes you feel good, and also reminds you that it's possible, and that it takes time, right? So I think a lesson from the Kindred work is just a reminder that, right, this, the multi-year process in the school is because you first have to create a relationship and an environment of communication where you can be honest with one another and really share, and that's what we tried to do in the 18-month grant period and even the period leading up to it. So that way, creating a space where Laura could be honest about the learnings as an early stage organization, that the goals we maybe had set were not going to be achieved, but the goals we had set around learning with each other were certainly being achieved every step of the way, and certainly informing the broader strategy for EFCT at the same time.
Thank you both. It sounds like you've learned a lot through this partnership from each other, and it's been a mutual learning experience. I'm curious to hear from both of you what's been like one really important key learning and insight through this relationship. Maybe Ira, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think that again, the learnings that Laura has accumulated for Kindred and her senior team around how this work happens, right? When she said that slide was busy and because all of those different components come together. For us, at least, I think the real reminder about what it takes to create an environment of such trust that people are willing to be honest and also ask and answer difficult questions. The work it takes for us as funders to do that with our grantees, and ideally, and certainly something we're after, with the end beneficiaries, right? Who are the people most affected by this work? Well, how do you set a table where they can be candid with you? And the power dynamic in philanthropy just makes that much harder. We heard about the power dynamic of schools. I think the power dynamic of philanthropy is equally as great, if not greater. And so therefore, we really have to take it upon ourselves as funders around how we can do our best to name that power dynamic and do our best to try to share power and build power among other stakeholders to help us address the solutions, because we as the funders don't have the answers, but we can invest in the people on the ground who do.
Great. And I'd say from my side, maybe two quick things to share. The first is that it is possible to build relationships with funders that are mutually beneficial. And even though that might sound obvious, because many of you on the phone, I'm sure, operate this way too, but as a new nonprofit that was trying to highlight an idea that wasn't an immediate test score outcome or an immediate attendance outcome, but was really talking about some of the root causes of inequity in our country that are grounded in racism. It has been difficult for us to find a set of aligned funders who really believe in that as a root cause worth investing in and worth exploring and investing in an innovative approach to engaging families as part of the solution. And meeting Ira and working with him over the past 2 years plus now has really restored my faith that it is possible to build that kind of relationship where it doesn't feel like there's a power dynamic there, even though obviously there's money involved, right? So, I mean, I can't say enough good things about how Einhorn does all of that and how Ira himself does that. And the second is, what I've really appreciated about Einhorn is how much thought they put into framing the idea of relationships as driving change. We do relationships plus a whole lot more, right? What you're doing is catalyzing the effects of the relationship and the trust to drive meaningful change for families. And the ways that they have researched and thought about that, I actually think are just a huge value add to the sector, and the willingness to invest in recognizing that and recognizing that relationships happen through authentic engagement. And in order to show up authentically, it takes time, and it takes back and forth, and it takes a series of small movements that allow people to trust one another, especially when we're talking about across lines of race. And so I've just really appreciated both of those things about working with Einhorn and with Ira in particular.
Great, thank you. And finally, Ira, what advice would you give to other funders who are looking to partner with parent-centered organizations that are focused on parent leadership and family engagement?
So there's a few things I think I would say to that. One is the real opportunity for this mutual learning, right? And that the way we can learn is by making a grant to an organization, doing the work and partnering with them, and that you can learn things that will influence your strategy, and also an opportunity through a parent-centered organization for us as funders to actually talk to parents on the ground and learn from them, right? So I am a parent myself of 2 elementary school age kids, but I'm always wearing the funder hat, right, in these conversations, even though I bring a parent lens to it, versus having folks who are doing the parent work through Kindred and other organizations. And so I was so grateful, this idea of partnership and how we could work together and learn together. I had not had the opportunity to go to DC to see a parent group in action. And then Laura offered this idea of coming to New York with Mike, right, and another parent, and then having a principal on Zoom. And then in exchange, I said, well, then we would invite other funders to come hear that as well. So it would help introduce her to other funders, but would let myself, as well as other members of ESCT's team who aren't assigned to this grant, to actually hear from parents about a program that we're funding and the difference it's making. And so I think we all need to get closer to the ground and to beneficiaries. And so working with a parent-centered organization is a way to do that. And the other piece of advice I would give is that this is a field that I think most of us know is under-resourced. And so finding ways to be flexible and think about early stage organizations like Kindred, because those of us who think this work is important as funders are already a small slice of the funding pie. And so how do we help put that out there and maybe take some risks because we know we could learn together? And then also that it takes time, right? If this had been a 6 to 9 month grant, we wouldn't have learned nearly as much, and it would have been hard to build that relationship. So the fact that we could make it an 18-month grant allowed us that deeper opportunity to learn together.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing these really great insights and experiences. And I know that there are a lot of questions, I think, coming in. So I would love to transition to our open discussion portion of today's webinar and address some of the questions that are coming in from the questions box. The first one that I have, let's see, I have one for Ira. Are there any specific ways, excluding just recognizing a power dynamic, that you were able to reduce the impact of the power dynamic?
I'd love for Laura to say how she thinks that we did that. I will say that what we tried to do is in our reporting framework, which like in the 5 years that I've been at EFCT, we have evolved reporting frameworks many, many times as we've tried to be a learning organization. And that we led with learning questions. We did say, like, what are the benchmarks that Laura thought she would reach? But then, you know, at the first report, I think it was, or maybe it was the second, where she said, we're now finding that that's not the key thing that's making a difference, or for us to spend the energy to try to reach that mark because you put it in the reporting framework is going to take us away from the places where we would actually advance the work and learn more that both she needed to learn and that we needed to learn. And so I think anchoring on the learning was one way of making it a little bit more of a mutual thing than a power thing. But I don't know if, Laura, you have other examples.
I would say that. So I will also say other foundations that we're fortunate to have been supporting our work do say that, and then they don't live it. They'll still sort of penalize you if you miss a number. And so I think that the way that Ira kept on saying that and saying, like, no, for real, like we care about is the learning, and if you don't hit that number, it's really going to be okay, because we know you are in a startup, and if you weren't trying to learn, I mean, that seems silly. Like, we expect you to miss some of these numbers. And so just like reinforcing that and reinforcing that mattered. And then the other thing is, I feel like Ira was always after, what is the DNA of Kindred, right? Me, yes, because at that time, I think I was the only staff member. But getting to know the DNA of the organization versus like just a set of outcomes, I think is what matters. I always felt like he was making an investment in the DNA of what Kindred could become and its potential to affect change. And so knowing that, it just felt aligned from the beginning. Like, he was trying to get to know me and what was driving the set of decisions at the time as a new social entrepreneur we were making in terms of investing and structure and all of those things. So maybe it's a combination of really getting to know the person with whom you're working within an organization. And then if you really are after learning outcomes, finding ways to really prove that that is what you are after, and not maybe just saying that and then doing something else, or having your organization have the reputation for doing something else.
Great, thank you. This other question is coming in. I think this is probably for Mike, and Laura, you can also chime in too, but what advice would you give to parents or parent organizations about getting to shift a mindset from the school as an authority figure to the school as a service provider and a collaborator? And also, how can parent organizations help parents get to that shifted mindset that you previously described, regardless of setting?
Wow, that's a tough question, because it's not something I even considered in my journey. But one of the things that I would think is probably most important is finding a way to show the parents the value of their voice. I can't prescribe that for you, but if not just, yeah, the parents need to see it more than anybody else. And I think the parents see it when the administration sees it. You know, when the parents feel comfortable enough first to share their input, and then feel valuable about their input, I think that shift starts to happen. And then there was a second part to your question about organizations, right?
Yeah. So advice for giving for parent organizations about getting to shift in the mindset from the school as an authority figure to the school as a service provider and collaborator, and then how can parent organizations help parents to shift their mindset?
Okay. Yeah. So I think that if it's a base value, if it's a foundational value for the organization, and you don't marry yourself to one particular process in order to accomplish that, I think that you'll find the way. And then once you find that way, just making sure that the parents see the result that their voice is valuable is probably, once the parents see that their voice is valuable, the shift begins. That's when it began for me. I hope I answered that question in a way that could be received.
I wonder, yeah, Mike, I just want to add one thing to what you shared that I've heard you reflect on before. And I think that was that Kindred does dialogue. We don't do training. We don't come believing that we have something that parents don't already have. And so parents actually experience that their voice matters to other people, that provides insight, and then they experience themselves, other parents providing insights in ways that they hadn't considered before. And it's that lived experience that I think is one of the things that makes dialogue different from other types of work with families.
As you said that, Laura, it was something else that you share in your presentation a lot about getting to the subconscious as opposed to trying to learn a new thing. Embedding something in the subconscious through that experience and through the emotive process as opposed to a cognitive process. I think there's something in that as well. There's value there as well.
Yeah, we go after emotions because that's where our unconscious behaviors exist.
Great, thank you both. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm trying to see if we have enough time for maybe one more question. This question I think would probably be for Laura. How have you addressed any language barriers among parents in the groups, or how has communication been facilitated among multilingual groups of parents?
Mm-hmm. So the majority language in DC other than English is Spanish. More than half our staff speak Spanish fluently with intentionality, and we have a way of running dialogue groups that we would call fluidly bilingual, which means that you don't wait for a translation and you don't have headsets, which can be very marginalizing. One facilitator is essentially translating about 2 seconds after the person who is speaking at the moment. And the same goes true for if a parent is making a comment, that translation is happening real time, whether it's in Spanish or English. We also oftentimes, if a group is majority or half Spanish speaking, we will start in Spanish and we will conduct the majority of the session with Spanish as the lead, which we think is really important for interruption of dominant culture mindsets. And then in one case, we had a deaf parent and the school system itself provided the ASL translator in that situation. And then the other language that's spoken frequently here, we did have a staff member who was from Ethiopia and able to speak in that language as well. And we continue to evolve and think about how to make that even more accessible as language groups, more language groups come into our groups and into the city. But that's a quick snapshot.
Great, thank you. So for the questions that weren't answered, I'm happy to share those with our speakers today and get some of those answers out to the group. Next slide, please. On behalf of the Funders Group, I do want to thank Laura for taking the time to share about this unique approach, and Mike for sharing your experience and your insights about parent-led dialogue and as a parent facilitator, and Ira, thank you for sharing how funders can authentically partner with parent-centered organizations. And I do want to thank everyone on the line for joining us and participating in such an engaging, thoughtful, and fruitful discussion. A special thank you to the Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health for hosting this webinar. And next slide, please. If you do want to stay connected with the Funders Group, there are a number of ways to plug in. We have our annual convening coming up on November 19th in Seattle. We'll have future webinars, so stay tuned for those. And then you can also become a member to access this network focused on parent leadership and family engagement. And a final reminder that you will receive the recording of today's webinar. And if you can please complete the survey following this session with some of your feedback, we would really value your input. Thank you all for participating and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.